If you were to say on this channel, I am nothing if not timely, and definitely hitting concepts and ideas at their peak of interest, you might be completely wrong. In all aspects of my life, timing has never really been my strong suit, so that obviously means now we get to talk about something that quite literally has been out for over like a year and a half at this point and well past its prime, because that's definitely the high point to discuss the ideas contained within. In the mountains of Eastern Europe, experiments would begin taking place on the townsfolk under the orders and directions of a woman named Mother Miranda. Utilizing the megamycete that she had discovered previously while mourning the loss of her daughter within the caves near the outskirts of town, she would come to understand that while her daughter may have been gone, she would be capable of essentially resurrecting her and utilizing the megamycete to do so. You see, the megamycete upon touching any human would absorb the genetic coding of the person and subsequently a piece of their memories and consciousness. Utilizing this, Mother Miranda's daughter Eva could be brought back into the living world by imprinting her memories and coding onto another child. The mold was able to initially come into contact with the girl's body after she was buried in their graveyard. In her experimentations after the formation of a religion formed from worshipping the black god, or really just a bundle of mold and bacteria supercelled organisms located in the cave systems, people would begin willingly allowing themselves to be experimented on and others not so much. This, however, would yield more interesting results. It became known that the mold would quite literally absorb all the genetic information within the body. Now, it would not steal the DNA, but simply make a copy and keep that copy for itself. By combining animal DNA and human DNA in the same body, the megamycete would continue to acquire knowledge of genetics for recombinations. Eventually, a way to implement these chimeric genes was created via the Cadu parasite. Upon implanting these into the bodies of individuals, this ultimately would allow certain people to become almost superhuman, if not a little distorted in the process. Now, this was not to say it was for all those who were created, but 4 in particular would go on to not only survive the process, but thrive, if you count some of these adaptations as thriving. They, however, were not suitable hosts for Miranda's daughter, but would be given 4 corners of the village in order to become the lords of the 4 houses. Having originally owned the village and been rather influential in their own rights, Alcina Dimitrescu, Salvatore Moreau, Donna Beneviento, and Carl Heisenberg would be put in charge to protect the pieces of Ethan Winter's daughter until the ritual could be completed. This would require Ethan to run into all of them at some point in order to retrieve his daughter. Now, a while back, we went over Dimitrescu, where everyone argued with me about how to pronounce it, and I'm pretty sure I have mispronounced it in this video, but I had a Romanian confirm I actually did pronounce it correctly, so ha! Anyhow, I think it's time we move on to more unfortunate lords and away from those where we just barely run out of her castle like, oh no, I hope I don't fall, and discuss Salvatore Moreau, where it really does become, oh no, I really hope I don't fall, and discuss his lore morphology, because let's be real here, good lord, how unfortunate for this guy. But there are context clues as to why he ended up the way he did, and why the megamycete is not perfect when restoring human forms back to what they originally were. So I believe the first place we should start, as with all things, is the beginning to explain what in the name of all this holy actually happened to this dude, because despite him being a bit of a dip, the reality is my boy here was pretty much screwed from the drop. Salvatore Moreau, or some people say Salvatore, was a lot like the others concerning the 4 families who owned the area, rich and powerful. Hailing from what appears to be a family of physicians, his clinic would serve the people of the town well, if probably not a little undersupplied due to location and difficulty getting medicine in. Now, this is just speculation, but it appears possible that Mother Miranda's daughter would have likely not been able to have been aided by the Moreau family, despite them being doctors, because the Spanish flu was wiping out people left, right, and center. So if you want to know the ironic thing about the Spanish flu actually is, though, it was first talked about in Spain, but many other countries were already dealing with this pandemic long before it was discussed openly in the papers, as not to affect the war morale during World War I. It was just called Spanish flu because they mentioned it first. So now you know how messed up that is. It appears to have its genes rooted in avian origin, so likely we would refer to it as the bird flu now. What was worse is the Spanish flu actually had a high mortality rate in people who were younger than 5 years old, but the reality of the situation was it attacked and knocked down healthy people all the same. 20 to 40-year-olds regularly lost the battle with the virus, and even to this day, we don't really know why it was so devastating. Regardless of the Spanish flu history lesson, this would eventually hit the town and take out Mother Miranda's daughter, where ultimately this would send her into a spiral where she would find her daughter's grave covered in mold before ultimately finding the megamycete underground and becoming aware that her daughter's consciousness had been copied and absorbed by the mold, meaning that a piece of her was still alive and could be resurrected. Now, I'm not suggesting that Mother Miranda intentionally screwed with Moreau the most, but it's not too far-fetched to think that she would hold a grudge or have some sort of resentment towards a doctor that wasn't able to help save her daughter, despite the Spanish flu really wrecking over 50 million people across the planet. And again, we have sequenced the genetic coding at this point, but we still don't fully understand why it was so detrimental to people. Isn't that fun? Potentially with this mindset going forward, let's move on to what actually happened to those infected. So those infected would need to have a surgical implant that allowed the genetic coding to be assimilated, but also there was an idea that came up, taking animal blood and injecting it into the body of the host along with the Cadu. Taking coding from Dimitrescu's daughter and combining it with a swarm of insects created their abilities that they possessed. With the Varkalek Alpha, this was a combination of human genes and wolf genes to create a chimeric beast that lives in my nightmares. With Salvatore Moreau, however, is it Salvatore or Salvatore? I don't know. Somebody say in the comments. I'm sure somebody will. He seemed to get the worst of the combinations of all. Taking his genetic coding, it appears that genes were basically chosen specifically for him, and specifically for the area that he needed to guard. Moreau's clinic was located near a water reservoir in the mountains, which, as you might guess, would be critically important. But in this area, there was also where the town would fish in order to sustain themselves. Prior to their infections, this area would have been critically important to the actual survivability of the village, but after their injections, it may have just been more about keeping people out of the area. With Moreau's changes, there appears to have been several things that were combined with him, and for good reason. Moreau was tasked with keeping the area secure from prying eyes or the occasional random person showing up. In fact, it is stated within the files that he would regularly snack on fishermen that came to the area, and this will be critically important later to figuring out what happened to him in the first place. This would mean regularly he would change his form in order to attack others who came to this area. But before getting to why this would be important, we must first understand both the physiological morphology of both his relatively human form, but also the more grotesque final form, as this will explain why both of these even exist in the first place. So you're not gonna believe it, but with all the movies I've been covering lately, I haven't been able to do this in forever. So, starting with the feet of his human form, we see actually they are fairly normal. It is possible that there are webbings in between the toes, which we will see later in the hands, but because he still retains a lot of his primate physiology in this form, they too have remained the same. Now, considering what we know about the changes to his genetics and the fact that he is semi-aquatic, we can assume that the tendons and ligaments of the ankles would have been strengthened for swimming purposes. However, structurally, not much has changed in this area. Moving up the legs, we see the general biped structure that we would expect from any hominid organism. However, once we get past the pelvis, things begin to change on the structure of Moreau. Now, internally, his skeleton is about the same regardless of what gives him his overall shape. That said, the Cadu, while normally implanted in the abdomen of a person, on Moreau, it was implanted about the upper thoracic spine to possibly the lower cervical spine. This is what leads me to believe that Moreau may have had a grudge against him concerning Mother Miranda, as this is a deviation from what is considered a normal implantation. This would go on to have later effects concerning his transformation. But speaking of upper thoracic, we can assume his abdomen is probably just about normal since no implant actually took place. Although, because of where the implant is, this has caused him to hunch over. His back has grown in cancerous ways in what appears to be a large tumor. The result is basically because of the Cadu parasite in this area and likely due to his regular transformations, which we will get to pretty soon. Moving down the arms, we can see they are quite long, with the humerus bone appearing much longer than normal, and the longer arm would allow him to swim better, almost like what you would see with professional swimmers. The larger back would also aid, as likely this is muscle built up from the Cadu parasite adapting his body, although the internal organs are likely changed as well, but we'll get to that a little later on. His forearms are about normal length, but getting to his hands, we begin to see more influence based on what he was combined with. Webbing between his hands allows him to grip more water with each swipe, allowing him to move through water with less effort than, say, you or I swimming. On each finger, while not necessarily a defense, he does have longer claws, although these may just be fingernails grown longer, as really, he's not taking care of himself at all. On his left arm, if you actually look closely, you can see that he has a tattoo that a sailor would typically sport, meaning that he was likely a sailor also himself at some point. Moving back up to the head, we see the face has become completely disfigured, which has had an impact on how he sounds and his mental psyche. His teeth have fallen out, and the ones that have stayed have become long and filed to points. The skin on his neck and face have become stretched out with bulbous growths underneath. His nose has become stubby, and a large brow ridge hangs over his eyes. Due to his posture from the Cadu parasite growing on his back, this has pushed his head forward, giving him forward head posture, straining the neck muscles, likely in the process. His skull has been stretched out as well, giving him more of a fish-like appearance. Some hair on the sides of his head does exist, but most of it has been lost on top, and this could be either due to age or stress to the integumentary system. His eyes have been pushed outwards, almost approaching the sides of his face entirely, meaning that the skull structure itself has changed. When he finally loses his cloak, we see that the parasite on his back have created large fleshy orbs, which may likely actually act as a form of swim bladder, allowing him to ascend and descend at will by filling them with water. We can only assume at this point that based on the changes to the body and the aquatic lifestyle that he either has gills based on the incoming genetic information from the fish, or he still acts like a mammalian aquatic animal such as a dolphin or whale and must come up for air. I doubt this is fully the case, however, because again, he has taken fish DNA, which has likely altered him and allowing him the ability to breathe both in and out of water. These fleshy orbs also contain many different eyes which visually relay information back to the Cadu parasite so it can continue to alter its form and respond to any possible aggression. Mentally, Clearly, this has had a pretty profound effect on his stability. While the other three lords typically kept their human form with the exception of Dimitrescu, who just grew to gigantic proportions. Nice. Carl and even Donna still remain the same. Although if I remember correctly, Donna may have been a bit disfigured herself, which is why she chose to use dolls to communicate rather than herself. But we'll get to her in a different episode. Because of the alterations to his body, Moreau had a low opinion of his own being. Attempting to get Mother Miranda to acknowledge him essentially, he was terrified that because he was a failed experiment, at least concerning being a vessel for Miranda's daughter, that he was going to be left behind. So because of this, he would follow orders without hesitation and do anything he could in order to win approval from Miranda. Now, simping to this caliber is never a good thing, but this would ultimately lead him down a path that likely had a worse influence on his meat suit as a result. Because of his eagerness to win approval from Miranda, he would guard the reservoir viciously and attack anything that ventured close. That would require him to shift into his final form quite regularly, which may have had unintended impacts of altering his human form more and more every time he did it. Because if you stretch out muscle and skin that much, as well as alter a human skeleton, eventually you won't go back to your regular person form. Dimitrescu was stated as saying when she underwent her transformation to attack Ethan on the tower that only Miranda had ever actually seen her true form, indicating that she doesn't do this regularly. And as a result, this may have helped her keep her form more human looking, if not making her larger than normal when she went back to her human form. However, had she kept transforming regularly like Moreau did in order to do Miranda's bidding, she too may have become disfigured, as we have seen with Salvatore, which would have been big sad hours. But now we must move on to what Moreau did to his body, or at least had done to him, to understand why this was a terrible idea to even change in the first place. Once transformed, Moreau is a hulking mass of what looks like several different things at once. The first and most obvious would be the fish genes that were definitely added into his genetic coding via the Cadu. However, from my perspective, the big one being the tail indicates to me that it was actually something else. Now, I'm not saying fish wasn't in there, because it absolutely was. There is something else in there. But also, the limbs themselves show, because early fish don't actually possess limbs like a terrestrial animal. Pretty wild, right? So we see the undersides of his stomach. There are several smaller supporting limbs on his body. Now, a case could be made that these are just human limbs, but due to the 4 fingers on them, this would indicate to me that specifically this is salamander DNA that has likely been introduced at some point. This because unlike lizards who have 5 fingers and 5 toes, and humans who have 5 fingers and 5 toes, and fish that don't have 5 fingers or 5 toes, salamanders have 4 fingers and 5 toes. So, if it's not coming from fish DNA, it's not coming from human DNA, and it's not coming from lizard DNA, then the Occam's razor option is salamander. The salamander skin and shape can also be seen overall concerning the longer tail and the limbs on top of the 2/3 of the body, as well as the head shape. Near the front of the monstrosity sits 2 larger limbs, which act as the main point of structural support and gives it the ability to run at you, knocking you down, which is extremely annoying. A long tail with a fin-like connection exists to help propel Moreau out of the water when he's stalking you in the flooded town section, but again, once you drain it, his regular limbs are still able to support him. On the back of this creature exists hundreds of eyes. This mutation seems to rise to give the Cadu parasite an almost probably about 270-degree field of view, so really, let's be honest, nothing is going to be sneaking up on him. This would likely have been inspired by the fish genes based on what is in the water around them. It'd be nice to see pretty much everything all at once, although I doubt anything is really going to be hunting this creature out in the open. Maybe a megalodon could actually take it, but that's about it. On the most frontal portion is the mouth. The mouth itself is a bit interesting as it indicates that the shell of Moreau becomes the form of Moreau also. Actually, let me see if I can explain that a little better. So within the mouth is Moreau, right? Which is a terrible place to be, seeing as when he does his attack, a ton of acid is spit up into the air, and then that proceeds to rain down on everything and scorches everything it touches. This also means that Moreau's inside is getting an acid bath whenever this happens, which begins likely also choking him out, indicating the noise that we hear when he does this. The outer shell of Moreau is the large fish monster. This expansion outwards from his body creates what we see on him, which then encapsulates Moreau from damage. The mouth is the indicator of what's happening. Likely when Moreau has completed whatever he needed to do, this form will constrict on him once more, covering his original body with a large fish monstrosity wrapper. Fusing back to the original cells of Moreau, his mouth actually shows that the fish monster bears many resemblance to its structuring that we see in the more original form. Doing this over and over again is what appears to have the issues, or at least cause the issues for Moreau, as if he stopped at one and done, this form would have never continued mutating to this point and then refuse over time with his original form, completely altering how he looks. Moving back to the fish monster, let's talk about the jaws real quick. Judging by some off-camera work that people have done so far, when falling into the water, you are quickly eaten by Moreau. The jaws open up to over 2 times the height of Ethan, indicating that they can expand to roughly about 11 to 12 feet easily, allowing for anyone to slip past the gaping maw and to their doom in the stomach of Moreau. But luckily, as long as you have a boomstick and you know how to stay out of the acid rain, you should be quite alright quite near survival. So the last thing I wanted to discuss concerning Moreau is what was likely to happen to him should you have not come around and put him out of his apparent misery, but also how was he able to control the cave formations, because we all saw those things expanding and it was really gross. It is suggested that Moreau couldn't actually exit the state that he found himself in during your last confrontation with him. That means that again, likely transforming in this way has more and more detrimental effects should you continue doing so. But also there may not be a safe point of return if completed too many times. Moreau, even just going after another fisherman, would have likely been stuck this way permanently, meaning that his usefulness outside of the flooded area would have eventually been his only point of usefulness in general that he would have served. Eventually, due to his burning desire to prove himself to Miranda, he was the architect of his own downfall, eventually fading into a back support role as the other lords took over the area, as he could no longer serve and no longer do anything. But there may have been a slight loophole to all of this. It's clear that just by thinking about the cave system pods, he was able to actually control the expansion of this material, which ultimately trapped Ethan in, forcing the confrontation. So the final question is, how is that possible? Well, it's clear to me that first we must establish these are in fact the cells of Moreau himself. Living inside of the mines and also throwing up that green liquid appears to seed the area with pieces of himself, which is where the Cadu comes into play concerning the connection of the host and mold. We know that the megamycete spreads through all areas within the cave systems. The mines are likely no exception to this, as the megamycete has saturated the soil within the confines of the town and likely also the surrounding mountains as well. Within the mine, because we can assume the mold is in there, also completely inundating the walls and floors and roof, or just being just below the surface, any cell that is placed on the surface would have an interaction with the mold and thus have the ability to be controlled by the megamycete. With the Cadu having the ability to interact with both the meat suit of Moreau as well as the megamycete, it's sort of like a liaison, it is able to transfer the will of Moreau to cause the megamycete to act accordingly. Think about Moreau just being a neuron that fires, Cadu being another neuron that continues that signal, and then the megamycete being like the muscle that contracts. So really what appears to be supernatural is really just a connection between the human body having the Cadu act as a bridge and the mold bacterial superorganism acting in response to that will. Because of this, Moreau is able to maintain control of the mine and just outside the mine to put up roadblocks to stop Ethan. Although again, it is just made out of cells, so it's not impossible to bypass. This would suggest that potentially this is how Heisenberg as well as Donna are able to control what they do with the mold by changing specific properties to allow them to interact with inanimate objects by simply thinking or moving them, which then causes the megamycete to move them for the person issuing the orders. Which is a little strange though, because we all really know who's in charge, and it's likely going to be the superorganism.